Sinner. Just the word itself sounds accusatory and judgmental. Indeed, for one person to label another a sinner is almost always a word of judgment. But then again, preachers like me stand in the pulpit and call an entire congregation a bunch of sinners, and for the most part, we get away with it. Because when we use the word, we include ourselves. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Monday, September 12th, 2022. In yesterday's gospel reading from Luke, we heard Jesus' response to the scribes and Pharisees who grumbled that he deigned to eat with sinners and tax collectors. I posed the question, where do we see ourselves in that encounter? Do we identify with the disciples who are the unidentified audience? Do we identify with the scribes and Pharisees, the upright religious leaders whose concern was for the moral purity of the people? Or do we identify with the sinners and tax collectors? I suggested that the pronouns we use, us, them, we, they, I, me, make a difference. Not only does it make a difference in how we understand ourselves, but it also makes a difference in how we treat others. For to the extent that we identify ourselves as the good people, we, like the scribes and Pharisees, place a barrier between ourselves and others. But if we count ourselves as part of the group identified as sinners and tax collectors, we place ourselves in proper relationship to God and to one another. In yesterday's gospel reading, Jesus responds indirectly to the scribes and Pharisees' grumbling by telling two parables. The first parable really says it all. Which of you, says Jesus, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Two big ideas flow from this sense of identity. First, to the extent that we count ourselves among the sinners, we acknowledge our proper standing before God. To stand as a sinner before God is to acknowledge, first of all, our absolute dependence upon God and upon God's grace. To identify ourselves any other way is to proclaim our independence from God. It is to say, we don't need God's forgiveness, and this puts us on mighty shaky ground before God. But identifying ourselves as sinners before God affirms our need for God's mercy and grace, and it sets us up to be grateful, which is where authentic discipleship begins. In the second place, to identify as a sinner places us on level ground with others. No longer do we think of ourselves as spiritually or morally superior. No longer do we think of ourselves as more worthy. Instead, we can regard others not as people who are beneath us, but fellow sinners who also stand in need of God's mercy and grace. Why is this important? Because if we see others as inferior, we cannot be truly compassionate. Instead, we become inordinately proud and self-satisfied, and we see ourselves as different, as set apart from others. But if we want to be the kind of people we are called to be, we have to recognize ourselves and others. We have to see ourselves as having a common humanity. Only then can we treat others as Christians should, with kindness and respect, even if they do not reciprocate. I know this sounds crazy, but we get into the most trouble as human beings when we begin to think of others as lesser human beings, or worse, as less than human. It then becomes all too easy to oppress our neighbor. We have to remember what Jesus says at the end of this little parable. There will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Tomorrow, the flip side of the coin, saints. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.